The cafe was glowing softly that evening, filled with warm yellow lights, laughter, and the faint smell of roasted coffee beans. It was a Friday night, the kind of night when people gathered not for grand performances but for a break from their busy lives. The small stage in the corner was ready for another round of the local open mic event, a place where anyone could come, sing, play an instrument, read poetry, or simply share something from their heart. The crowd was made up of regulars, college students with sketchbooks, young musicians hoping to be noticed, and couples sipping from shared cups sat scattered across the room. Everyone knew everyone, or at least everyone thought they did. It was a friendly, familiar crowd. That was until a quiet woman walked in through the door. She was older than most people in the cafe, maybe in her late 40s or early 50s. Her long coat was worn out at the edges, and the violin case she carried looked like it had seen years of travel. She didn't seem nervous, but there was something about her that drew a few curious glances. Not because she stood out, but because she seemed to be trying so hard not to. She moved slowly to the sign-up table near the stage, where a cheerful young man was managing the list. "You here to perform?" he asked with a bright grin. She nodded quietly, speaking so softly that he had to lean closer to hear her name. She wrote it down herself at the bottom of the list, then gave a polite smile and went to sit in the corner of the room, near the window. Her hands rested on the violin case, fingers gently brushing the handle as if to comfort herself. No one paid much attention to her after that. The evening went on with laughter and chatter. A teenage boy sang a love song he had written himself. A group of friends played a cheerful tune on a guitar and cajon. Someone even did stand-up comedy, filling the room with laughter that echoed off the wooden walls. The mood was light, easy, and fun. The woman, who had told no one her story, sat quietly through it all. Every time someone finished their performance, she clapped softly, with a small, genuine smile. But her eyes gave away something else, something deeper. There was a quiet sadness there, a mixture of fear and longing, as if she was searching for courage within herself. At one point, a waitress came by to offer her a drink. The woman ordered tea and thanked her politely. When the waitress brought it, she noticed the woman's hands trembling slightly as she lifted the cup. "Are you okay?" she asked kindly. The woman smiled faintly. "Just a little nervous. It's been a long time since I played." The waitress smiled back, not thinking much of it. People got nervous all the time before performing, but she didn't know that the woman's words carried years of history behind them. Because the truth was, this was not just another performer. Years ago, that same woman had been known for something extraordinary. She had once stood on grand stages under blinding lights, playing to thousands of people who would rise to their feet after every performance. Her music had been described as pure emotion, the kind that could make people cry without understanding why. But that life felt like another world now, something lost and unreachable. Back then, she had everything a musician could dream of: recognition, respect, the joy of being surrounded by orchestras and fellow artists, until one night a terrible accident changed everything. She had been in a car on her way to a concert when a truck skidded across the icy road. The crash wasn't fatal, but it left her with a deep scar in her life, one that couldn't be seen from the outside. When she woke up in the hospital, she learned that she had partially lost her hearing in one ear. For most people, that would be an inconvenience. But for a violinist, it was a heartbreak. Music wasn't just about playing notes, it was about feeling sound, balance, harmony. And when she tried to play again, everything felt different, unsteady, her confidence shattered. In the years that followed, she quietly disappeared from the world of performance. She gave away most of her fine dresses, sold her concert violin, and moved to a small town far from the noise of the city. She began teaching children how to play instead, something gentle, something safe. She told herself she was content with that. But deep down, she missed the stage more than she could admit. So when she heard about this open mic night at the cafe, a simple, welcoming place where anyone could perform, something inside her stirred. Maybe it was time, she thought. Maybe it was time to try again. Not for fame or applause, but for herself. And that's how she found herself sitting there among strangers waiting for her turn. Hours passed. Performers came and went. The list grew shorter. Some people left after finishing their songs. Others stayed, chatting with friends. By the time her name was called, only a small crowd remained. "Next up, we have..." The host squinted at the list. "Miss Elena." She rose quietly. A few heads turned, surprised that the quiet woman in the corner was actually performing. She walked up to the stage, her coat brushing softly against her legs. When she placed her old violin case on the stool and opened it, a few people noticed the careful way she handled it, like someone greeting an old friend. The cafe had grown quieter now. Even those not particularly interested in classical instruments leaned in out of curiosity. Elena stood there for a moment, her eyes closed, breathing slowly. The violin, though scratched and aged, seemed to glow under the soft stage light. She lifted it to her chin, adjusted the bow, and began to play a few tuning notes. The sound was slightly shaky at first. A few whispers ran through the crowd. But then, as she took her first real stroke of the bow, something shifted. A gentle melody filled the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just soft, tender, and deeply human. Her music carried warmth like sunlight after rain. The notes flowed together, each one speaking where words could not. Within seconds, the cafe was completely silent. Even the coffee machines in the back seemed to fade into the background. No one looked at their phones. No one spoke. Everyone was watching her. As she played, her eyes stayed closed, her expression calm but full of feeling. She wasn't performing to impress anyone. She was telling a story, one of loss, love, and rediscovery. Those who listened closely could feel it. There was pain in her music, but also healing. There was struggle, but also peace. It was as if she was letting the audience glimpse into years of silence, regret, and finally, courage. When she reached the final note, her bow hovered in the air for a second before lowering slowly. The last sound lingered like a sigh that no one wanted to end. Then, for a moment, there was nothing but stillness. And suddenly, applause broke out. Soft at first, then louder until the whole room was clapping, cheering, and even standing. The woman smiled, her eyes glistening under the lights. She nodded in gratitude, said a quiet thank you, and walked off the stage. She didn't stay to soak in the applause. She simply closed her violin case, held it close to her chest, and returned to her corner. People looked at her differently now, not as a shy stranger, but as someone who had touched their hearts. No one knew her story yet. No one knew who she really was. But everyone in that cafe felt something they couldn't quite explain. They had come expecting a casual night of music. Instead, they had witnessed a quiet miracle, one that began with an old violin, a trembling hand, and the courage to play again. And as the cafe lights dimmed, the whispers began. "Who is she?" Someone asked. "I don't know," another replied softly. But that was incredible. The woman sitting by the window smiled faintly to herself. She didn't need them to know. Not yet. For the first time in years, she felt peace, because she knew this was just the beginning. After that evening at the cafe, life around the small town went on as usual. The streets were busy, the markets were loud, and the same faces passed by every morning. But inside that little cafe, something had changed. People couldn't stop talking about the mysterious woman with the old violin. Her performance had left a mark on everyone who had been there. The cafe owner said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard on his stage. The young musicians who usually laughed and joked after open mic nights were strangely quiet that evening. They had felt something powerful, something that words couldn't describe. But no one knew who she was. She hadn't told anyone her full name, hadn't left any contact number, hadn't even stayed long enough to talk after her performance. She had just quietly packed her violin and disappeared into the cool night air, leaving only questions behind. In the following days, a few people tried to find out more. The cafe owner asked around, but no one seemed to know her. The waitress who had served her tea said she'd never seen her before that night. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere, played her heart out, and vanished again. But while everyone else was wondering who she was, the woman herself was living a quiet, simple life not too far away. She lived in a small house near the edge of town, surrounded by old trees and silence. Her home was peaceful, books stacked neatly on shelves, a small table by the window, and her violin resting in its case nearby. It wasn't a rich person's house, but it was full of warmth. Every morning she woke up early, made herself a cup of tea, and opened the window to let the morning light in. Then she would sit by her desk and start planning lessons for her students. For the last 10 years, she had been teaching children how to play the violin. Most of them were beginners, full of energy but short on patience. They didn't know much about her past, and she didn't tell them. To them, she was simply Miss Elena, their quiet, kind teacher, who sometimes smiled when they got a tune right and sometimes closed her eyes when they made mistakes, as if remembering something. But behind that calm smile was a story she had never shared. Once, many years ago, she had been someone else, someone the world had admired. Back then, she had stood on grand stages under glowing lights, playing for audiences that held their breath every time her bow touched the strings. She had traveled across countries, performing in beautiful concert halls where people clapped until their hands hurt. Her name had been printed on posters, magazines, and programs. She had been a rising star in the classical music world, a gifted violinist whose performances could make people cry without knowing why. But fame is a strange thing. It can lift you high, but it can also vanish in an instant. That instant came one cold winter night. She had been traveling to a concert with her small team when the car she was in lost control on a frozen road. The crash was sudden and violent. When she woke up in the hospital days later, she was covered in bruises and her world felt strangely quiet. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive, but there was permanent damage. Her hearing in one ear had been affected. She could still hear, but not the same way. The tones were off, the balance was gone. For a violinist, that was like losing a piece of her soul. At first, she tried to fight it. She practiced for hours, pushing herself to play the way she used to. But every time she picked up the bow, something felt wrong. The music sounded different. Notes that once came effortlessly now felt heavy, uncertain. Her confidence broke. She started canceling concerts, first one, then another, until the invitations stopped coming. The newspapers began to speculate. Some said she was ill. Others said she had retired early. No one knew the truth, that she simply couldn't bear to hear herself play anymore. Eventually, she left the city. She moved to the countryside, where no one recognized her name, and tried to start over. She told herself she didn't need the stage anymore. She told herself she was happy teaching children, watching them discover music for the first time. And in many ways she was. Her students brought joy to her life. Their laughter filled her home and their progress gave her purpose. But deep inside, there was still a quiet ache every night. Before going to bed, she would open her violin case, run her fingers along the strings and whisper to herself, maybe one day. Then she would close it again. That one day finally came by accident. One of her students, a lively little girl, told her about the cafe's open mic night. "You should come, Miss Elena," the girl said excitedly. "Anyone can play there. You don't have to be famous or anything. People just come to share music." Elena smiled politely and said she would think about it. She didn't tell the child that she hadn't performed in public for more than 15 years. But later that night, she found herself thinking about it again and again. She tried to ignore the thought, but it kept returning. She missed the sound of applause, the warmth of the lights, the connection between performer and listener. It wasn't about fame anymore. It was about something more personal, about finding the courage to be herself again. And so after days of hesitation, she finally decided to go. She didn't tell anyone. She simply packed her violin, put on her old coat, and took the bus to town. Her heart was pounding the whole way there. She had no idea what she would play or how people would react. She only knew that she needed to do this for herself. That's how she ended up in that small cafe that Friday evening, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for her turn. When she played that night, something inside her broke open and something new began to heal. It was as if all the years of silence, fear, and self-doubt melted away in that moment. Her hands remembered what her heart had never forgotten. She didn't think about her lost hearing or the mistakes she might make. She just played. And for the first time in years, the music flowed freely. When the performance ended and people clapped for her, she didn't see them as an audience. She saw them as witnesses to her return, her rediscovery. That night, when she went home, she didn't sleep right away. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring out into the dark sky. The moonlight fell softly across her violin case. She smiled quietly to herself. The applause still echoed in her ears, not as a sound, but as a feeling. It wasn't about being perfect anymore. It wasn't about being famous. It was about being brave enough to begin again. In the days that followed, she went back to her usual routine, teaching, cooking, tending to her small garden. But something inside her had changed. She felt lighter, freer. Her students noticed it too. She smiled more. She hummed softly during lessons. Sometimes she even picked up the violin and played a few notes while her students watched in awe. One afternoon, as she was closing her music books, she heard a knock on the door. It was the cafe owner standing there with a friendly grin. He had tracked her down after asking around town. "I just wanted to say," he said, "your music that night, it touched everyone. You should come back and play again. People are still talking about you." She laughed softly, a little embarrassed. "I didn't think anyone would remember." "Are you kidding?" He said, "No one's forgotten. We even had people coming back the next day asking who you were." She thought about it for a moment and said, maybe I will." That night she sat at her piano and began to write again, something she hadn't done in years. Not for an audience, not for fame, but for the simple love of music. The world didn't know it yet, but her story was far from over. What started as a quiet return to a small cafe would soon become something much bigger, something that would touch hearts far beyond that little town. But for now, she was content with the simple joy of having played again. After years of silence, her music had finally found its way back into the world, and this time it was stronger, more human, and more beautiful than ever before. The next Friday evening came quietly, but for her it felt different this time. The week had passed peacefully, her music classes, her morning walks, her tea by the window, but somewhere deep inside, she knew something had changed forever. That night at the cafe had woken something in her that she thought had died years ago. For days she couldn't stop replaying it in her mind. The lights, the stillness, the way people had listened with their hearts. It wasn't the applause that stayed with her. It was the feeling of being free again. She had promised the cafe owner she might come back to play, but she hadn't given a date. Still, as the next open mic night approached, her heart began to whisper to her again. "Maybe one more time," it said. She spent that week quietly practicing. Every evening after finishing her lessons, she would sit by the window, open her violin case, and let her fingers move across the strings. At first she played cautiously, afraid the old fear would return, the fear of being imperfect, the fear of being heard. But it didn't. Each night the sound grew stronger, steadier, and more alive. Her house once again filled with music, the kind that came not from the desire to impress, but from love. That Friday she decided she would go. She dressed simply, wearing the same old coat and carried the same violin case. When she arrived at the cafe, a few people recognized her immediately. They whispered to each other and smiled. The owner spotted her and hurried over, his face lighting up. "You came back," he said, excited. She smiled shyly. "Just for a little while." The cafe was even more crowded this time. Word had spread about her previous performance. People had told their friends, and their friends had told others. Many had come just to see if the rumors were true, that an unknown woman had played the violin like a dream. She took her usual seat by the window, watching the crowd. Young singers tuned their guitars, a poet rehearsed quietly, and a small group of college students laughed in one corner. The air was warm with energy and anticipation. When her turn finally came, the host announced, "And now we have a very special guest returning to our stage tonight. You might remember her from last week, the one and only Elena!" The room erupted in claps and cheers. People who hadn't even heard her before clapped out of curiosity. Everyone seemed eager to see what she would do this time. She walked up to the stage, heart steady but eyes soft with emotion. She placed her violin case on the stool, opened it, and took out her instrument. The old wood gleamed faintly under the cafe's lights. She stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then looked out at the crowd. It wasn't fear she felt this time. It was gratitude. She raised her violin to her chin and began to play. The first note was clear, soft, and full of warmth. Then came the next and the next, weaving together a melody so gentle that even the sound of coffee cups clinking stopped. The music filled every corner of the cafe, wrapping around the people like a quiet embrace. It was a song she had written herself years ago, one she had never performed publicly. It was about loss, recovery, and the strength to start again. As she played, her face reflected every emotion she felt, the pain of the past, the peace of the present, and the quiet hope for the future. Each movement of her bow carried a story. Each note seemed to speak for her in a language beyond words. The crowd listened silently. Even those who didn't usually care for classical music were completely drawn in. Something about the way she played made them feel connected, not just to her but to their own hidden emotions. There was an old man sitting at the counter who wiped his eyes quietly. A young couple held hands, listening closely. Even the waiters paused for a moment, forgetting their work. Her music had a way of touching people's hearts directly, without needing explanation. Halfway through her performance, the melody grew stronger. The soft notes turned bold, the rhythm fuller. It was as if she was fighting through something invisible, something inside her that had held her back for years. Her body moved with the music now, her fingers flying across the strings with precision and passion. The audience could feel it. They didn't know her story, but they could sense that every sound came from a lifetime of struggle and courage. It wasn't just music anymore, it was her truth. When she reached the final part of her song, she slowed down. The music softened again, like the sound of waves fading into the distance. Her eyes closed, her breathing even. And as the last note hung in the air, she lowered her bow gently. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then the room exploded with applause. People stood up, clapping, cheering, even whistling. Some called her name. Others just shouted, "Bravo!" And that was amazing. The sound filled the cafe and spilled into the street outside. She looked up, surprised and touched. She hadn't expected this kind of reaction. A shy smile spread across her face. She bowed her head humbly, thanking everyone with a small nod. But something unexpected happened next. As she was about to leave the stage, one of the young musicians who had played earlier approached her with wide eyes. "Excuse me," he said, "I think I know you. You used to play in the Vienna Philharmonic, right?" The cafe went silent again. People looked at him, then at her. She froze for a second, caught off guard. The young man continued, "I studied music history in college. I saw an old video once of a violinist who looked just like you. You played at the Royal Concert Hall about 20 years ago. Everyone said your performance was unforgettable." A soft murmur spread across the room. Some people gasped quietly. Others looked at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. She could have denied it. She could have smiled and walked away, but she didn't. She looked at the young man, her eyes kind but tired, and said softly, "Yes, that was me." The room fell completely silent. "You could almost hear hearts beating," she continued. "That was a long time ago. Life took me in a different direction." The young musician looked stunned. "But why did you stop?" "You were incredible," she smiled faintly. "Sometimes we lose things along the way. But if they're truly part of us, they find their way back." The cafe was quiet again, not the kind of silence that comes from awkwardness, but the kind that comes from respect. Everyone there knew they had just witnessed something rare, not just a great performance, but a story of resilience. The owner stepped forward, his voice trembling a little. "You know," he said, "I think everyone here will remember this night for a long time." She nodded gratefully, holding her violin close. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening." When she left the stage, people moved aside to let her pass. Some tried to speak to her, but she only smiled and kept walking. She didn't need words anymore. The music had said everything. That night, when she stepped out of the cafe, the air was cool and fresh. The stars shimmered above, and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted faintly from behind her. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. As she walked home, she thought about everything. The years she had spent in silence, the fear she had carried, the way her hands had trembled the first time she played again. And now, here she was, not as a broken musician, but as someone who had found her strength again. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel like she was running from her past. She was walking toward her future. Her steps were slow but steady, her violin case held close to her heart. She didn't know what would come next, whether she would perform again or not. But she did know one thing. She had rediscovered her voice. And once you find your true voice again, you never really lose it. After that unforgettable night, the cafe was buzzing with excitement for days. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened, the moment the quiet woman revealed she was once a world-famous violinist. The story spread quickly, first among the regular customers, then across the small town. Some people shared short clips on their phones. while others described the moment with wide eyes and gestures, as if they still couldn't believe it had happened in their little cafe. The cafe owner started receiving calls from people who wanted to know when she would play again. Musicians from nearby cities began visiting, hoping to catch another glimpse of her performance. It was as if her music had awakened something not just in her, but in everyone who had heard her. But for her, life didn't change overnight. She went back to her normal routine, teaching her students, walking through the park, buying groceries from the same small market. She didn't go looking for attention or fame. She had lived through that before, and she knew how quickly it could disappear. Still, she couldn't deny that something was different now. Her phone started ringing more often. Former colleagues, old students, and even journalists reached out after seeing the videos online. She was surprised to find that people still remembered her from all those years ago. One afternoon, while she was finishing a lesson, one of her students said, "Miss Elena, my mother saw you on the internet. She said you were famous." The little girl's eyes were full of excitement, but Elena only smiled softly. "That was a long time ago," she said gently. "Now I'm just happy to be your teacher." The child nodded, but she didn't stop talking about it for the rest of the lesson. It made Elena laugh quietly. She had forgotten how curious children could be. That evening, after her students left, she sat by her window again, the same place where she always reflected on her day. The sun was setting, and the golden light fell softly on her violin. She picked it up and played a few slow notes. They sounded warm and full, just like the feeling in her heart. She thought about how far she had come, from being afraid to even touch her violin, to standing on a stage again. It felt almost unreal, but she didn't realize that her story was about to travel far beyond her small town. A week later, she received an unexpected visitor. The cafe owner came to her house holding his phone with excitement. "You won't believe this," he said, showing her the screen. "A video of your performance has gone viral. Look at this. Hundreds of thousands of people are watching it. And the comments, people are saying your music made them cry." She blinked in surprise, staring at the screen. There she was, playing her violin on that small stage, her face calm and peaceful. She could hear the cheers, see the clapping, and feel the same emotion she'd felt that night. She wasn't sure how to react. She wasn't someone who chased fame anymore. But seeing all those messages from people around the world touched her deeply. Some wrote, "I don't know who she is, but her music healed me." Others said, "This performance made me believe in second chances." Those words stayed with her. She realized that maybe her music could still have meaning, not on big stages or in grand halls, but in the hearts of people who needed to hear it. Soon, local news channels began reaching out. One evening, a small crew came to the cafe to film a short interview about her. She agreed, not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted to share her story honestly. When the interviewer asked, "What made you return to music after so many years?" she smiled softly and said, "I never really left it. Music never leaves you. It waits patiently until you're ready to play again." The video was broadcast a few days later, and it spread even more widely. Musicians from different countries started sending her messages. Some invited her to perform again. Others simply thanked her for reminding them why they loved music in the first place. But the attention also brought back memories, some sweet, some painful. She remembered her old orchestra, her friends from those days, and the concert halls where she had once played. She remembered the accident, the hospital, the endless silence that followed. There was one particular message that made her pause. It was from her old conductor, the man who had guided her when she was young and uncertain. His message was simple: "I always believed you would return to music. You still have a home here if you ever wish to play again." She read that message many times that night. The thought of returning to the same orchestra felt heavy. She wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of spotlight again. Yet a small part of her heart stirred with possibility. The next morning, she went for a walk through the park. The air was crisp, the trees golden with the change of season. She watched children running around, laughing freely, and for a moment she felt a quiet peace settle over her. She realized that she didn't need a grand comeback. What mattered most was that she had found her way back to the things she loved. Still, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. One day, while she was teaching, a man knocked on the door of her small music room. He introduced himself as a representative from a foundation that organized concerts for charity. He had seen her video online and wanted to invite her to perform at a special event, an evening concert to raise funds for children's education. He said, "We don't want a celebrity show. We want music that comes from the heart. And your story," it touched us all. At first she hesitated. The thought of standing before a large audience again made her nervous. But then she remembered all the people who had written to her, the ones who said her music had given them hope. Maybe this was her chance to give back. She finally agreed. The night of the charity concert came quickly. It was held in a small theater, nothing like the grand concert hall she had once known, but the atmosphere was full of warmth. The audience wasn't there to judge or criticize. They were there to feel something real. As she walked onto the stage, she felt a calmness she hadn't known before. This time she wasn't performing for applause or recognition. She was there to share her heart, her journey, her rediscovered love for music. When she began to play, the notes flowed effortlessly. Every sound carried the story of her life, the highs and the lows, the silence and the return. The crowd sat in quiet amazement. Many of them didn't even know who she was, but they could feel every emotion in her music. By the end of her performance, there were tears in many eyes. The applause that followed wasn't wild or loud, it was heartfelt. People stood up slowly, clapping not just for her skill, but for her courage. After the concert, a young girl came up to her and said, "I want to play the violin like you someday." She smiled warmly and placed her hand on the girl's shoulder. "You can," she said. "Just never stop believing in the music inside you." That moment touched her more than any applause could. As she packed up her violin later that night, she realized something important. Her return to music wasn't about fame or redemption. It was about connection, about reminding people and herself that no matter how broken life feels, art has the power to heal. When she stepped outside the theater, the cool night air greeted her once again. The stars shimmered just as they had that first night after the cafe performance. She looked up, smiled, and whispered a quiet thank you to life, to music, and to the courage that had finally brought her back. From that day on, she continued to play, not in huge halls, but in schools, community centers, and small gatherings. Wherever she went, people listened not just to her notes, but to her story. And slowly, her name once again became known. Not as the prodigy who disappeared, but as the woman who found her way back through music. The months that followed were like a quiet sunrise in her life. Everything began to change, but slowly, gently, just the way she liked it. After the charity concert, more people began reaching out. Some invited her to perform. Others simply wanted to meet her, to talk about how her story had touched them. She didn't accept many offers, though. She didn't want to chase the spotlight again. She only accepted the ones that felt meaningful, the ones that carried purpose. She started visiting schools, community centers, and music clubs, sharing her story with young students who dreamed of becoming musicians one day. She would stand in front of them, her violin resting in her hands, and tell them, "Don't be afraid to start again. Even when life takes everything away, music, or whatever you love, can always bring you back." Her words came from experience, and people could feel that. She spoke softly, but her voice carried strength. The children loved her because she didn't talk like a star. She talked like someone who understood their fears. In one school, she met a shy boy who had stopped playing the violin after losing his father. He told her, "I can't play anymore. Every time I try, I remember him and I cry." She looked at him kindly and said, "Then play through your tears. That's when the real music begins." She helped him tune his instrument, guided his fingers gently, and played a short duet with him. The boy's hands trembled at first, but soon, the sound began to flow. When they finished, he smiled for the first time in months. Moments like that filled her heart in ways fame never could. Meanwhile, the video of her cafe performance kept spreading online. More and more people discovered it. Some called her the disguised virtuoso, while others simply referred to her as the woman with the violin who played from the soul. She didn't mind what they called her. What mattered to her was that people were feeling something genuine from her music. That was all she ever wanted, to touch hearts even quietly from far away. One evening, she received an invitation from a music festival abroad. They wanted her to be the guest of honor and perform a special closing piece. At first, she hesitated. It would mean traveling, facing a large crowd and stepping onto a grand stage again, something she hadn't done in almost 2 decades. She sat by her window for hours, holding the letter in her hands. The sun was setting, and the golden light made the words on the paper glow softly. She thought about the little cafe, about the children she taught, about the people who had believed in her even when she had stopped believing in herself. Finally, she smiled and whispered, "Maybe it's time." Weeks later, she boarded a plane for the first time in many years. The journey was quiet, and she spent most of it gazing out the window at the clouds. The world looked so peaceful from above, endless, open, full of possibilities. When she arrived at the festival, the organizers welcomed her warmly. They had heard stories about her, the mysterious violinist who disappeared and then returned to move hearts again. The theater was beautiful, filled with warm lights and the soft murmur of anticipation. Before the show, she sat backstage, holding her violin, breathing slowly. Her hands were calm, not shaking the way they used to. She thought about her journey, the accident, the silence, the cafe, the rediscovery. Every step, every setback had led her here. When her name was announced, the audience rose in applause. She walked out slowly, her heart steady. The light hit her face, and for a brief moment, she felt the same thrill she had felt years ago, the thrill of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. She began to play. The first note floated gently into the hall, pure and steady. The sound filled the space like a whisper carried on the wind. The crowd fell silent. Every note told a story, kind of pain, loss, healing, and hope. Her bow danced across the strings with grace, her expression calm but full of feeling. Halfway through her performance, something extraordinary happened. A small group of children from one of the schools she had visited appeared on stage. The organizers had planned it as a surprise. Each child carried a small instrument, violins, flutes, cellos. She turned and smiled, recognizing them immediately. Together, they began to play a simple melody she had once taught them. The harmony was soft but powerful. It was no longer just her story now. It was theirs too. The audience watched with tears in their eyes. They weren't witnessing a comeback. They were witnessing a transformation. The woman who had once played for fame was now playing for love. When the final note ended, the hall erupted in applause. People stood up, cheering, clapping, some even crying openly. She bowed gracefully, her heart overflowing with gratitude. After the show, reporters asked her questions, but she kept her answers simple. "I didn't come back to be famous again," she said with a gentle smile. "I came back because music is my home, and sometimes you have to lose yourself before you can find your way back." That night, she walked outside the theater and looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright, just like they had been on that first night after the cafe performance. She took a deep breath, feeling at peace. The world had changed around her, but inside she felt the same, humble, thankful, and full of quiet joy. Over the following months, she continued to travel and perform at small events, always keeping her promise to herself, never to play for fame, only for truth. She donated most of her earnings to music programs for children, helping those who couldn't afford instruments or lessons. Her house remained the same, simple, filled with warmth, her violin resting near the window. She never replaced it with a newer one. That old violin had been with her through every season of her life, and its sound carried her story within it. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit alone, playing soft tunes just for herself. The world outside would be silent, and the only sound would be her bow gliding gently across the strings. Those moments reminded her of everything she had learned, that it's never too late to begin again, that courage often hides in quiet hearts, and that real talent isn't about perfection, but honesty.